A&P, we're kind of back with doing a little bit more with the muscles now. So we've been talking about the last few here about how muscles contract, and one of the things we saw quite a bit was in order for the sliding filaments to happen, the myosin and actin to interact, we needed ATP. We need ATP for the pumps to set up the membrane potential. We needed pumps going to pump the calcium into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Again, all these things require energy. So I think you can kind of see that, at least in terms of muscle contraction, this is an energy intensive process. So one of the things we have to talk about is how do muscles go about getting their energy. This is going to be a little bit of stuff that should be somewhat reviewed from biology a bit. We're going to be talking a little bit about energy metabolism, so a little bit hitting on kind of cellular respiration and some of that. Again, I'm not going to be asking you to know all the steps. I'm not going to be asking you to know enzymes of this, but we're really getting into what are the energy systems that are necessary for the body to continue muscle activity. So we're going to see, at least in terms of skeletal muscle, there's really three different ways that these muscle cells are going to generate ATP. We have something that's really kind of we have a little bit of stored ATP, but not very much. Outside of that, we have this kind of very immediate supply by what is called the creatine phosphate system or the phosphagen system, which we'll talk about what that is. We can then do, until at least breathing rate and heart rate come up, we can do anaerobic cellular metabolism here in order to generate ATP without oxygen. But again, it's a limited amount of time we can do that, and it does generate a lot of waste products, which will kind of inhibit muscle contraction the more we do that. And then when we get to the long term here, as once your breathing rate and heart rate go up and you get to more of a steady state of activity, we're going to be using our normal aerobic cellular respiration, which is glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain to generate those ATP from glucose or other sources, sometimes fatty acids, proteins every once in a while as well. So how we're doing this is with ATP. So if you look at ATP, it's a little thing here. It is basically an RNA base with this nitrogenous base. It's an RNA with a nitrogenous base kind of attached to it here. We then have three phosphates connected to this. So when you break this last bond, it releases energy, and we a lot of times can use this energy to do work, to reduce the energy necessary for an enzyme to be active, things along those lines. So in terms of stored ATP, we do not have a lot of this in the muscle. ATP takes up a lot of space. It takes a lot of weight to store it as well. So in a muscle, we generally have stored ATP for on average, about 5 seconds of activity, which is not much in the way of activity. That's not very long to be doing anything. Because of that, we need more ways to generate ATP. There's been kind of case studies and stuff done talking about how much ATP you would need to do something more active. So the one time I read a case study, it was talking about ATP required to run a marathon. It was when Gabrielasi was the world record marathoner, which was like 2:03. They did all the math, and they figured for him to be able to do this, he needed, I remember what it was, but it was something like 100 or 90 some kilograms of ATP. And this was for somebody that's 55 kilograms in weight. So he needed twice his body weight of ATP stored and able to do this. And you might kind of say, well, that's running a marathon. But even then, stored ATP, you need about 200 pounds of ATP stored to do your normal metabolism for a day. So we are continuing to have to generate this ATP because we can't store enough away to have it going for the whole day. We cannot do an ATP battery that we tap into all day and then recharge it at night. It's just not possible. So ATP, we use it for more than just our normal. We use it for normal functioning along with muscle contraction. So we a lot of times need glucose or kind of glucose polymers, which is glycogen, and we can use that to break that down to generate a lot of this ATP. One of the systems we have that is in a short-term idea here, and this is what we would refer to as substrate level phosphorylation. So we have a particular substrate that has a phosphate on it. If we can take that phosphate off this substance and put it onto ADP, which is ATP minus a phosphate, we can regenerate ATP. So what we can do is, if you have, and this is at rest when you have plenty of ATP, if you can take creatine and you put a phosphate onto it, and this is an enzyme does this called creatine kinase, we can end up with ADP and creatine phosphate. And then if we are at rest, we can take this ADP and make more ATP with it. What this means, though, is then we now have this molecule here, creatine phosphate, where it has that phosphate attached. And what we can do very quickly a lot of times with activity is, if you have this phosphate, as you start using ATP, you're going to have ADP. We can then have this enzyme catalyze this reaction, take the phosphate off of creatine, put it back onto ADP, and we're going to have ATP that we can use really quickly. And this is what happens after you use up those ATP stores for about the next 15 seconds or so. We can take this creatine phosphate and ADPs, take the phosphate off of these and go back to creatine, but it gives us some ATP. And this can power contraction, the membrane pumps, and other stuff like that. This is an energy system, and this is the kind of things I can ask some of the time. That would be something like if you were doing a 100-meter dash, or even the 200-meter dash, or if you're doing like weightlifting, something real quick burst activities. This is going to be about the only energy system you actually tap into on those ones. We do also have an enzyme called myokinase, that if you have two ADPs, if you take a phosphate off an ADP to make it AMP, or adenosine monophosphate, and put it onto the adenosine diphosphate, the ADP, you can get ATP. So this is another way we get a few more seconds. So the main thing is here, we're using creatine phosphate, using this myokinase, we can get about another 20 seconds of activity from these processes. So again, when you think about doing exercise, this is not a long period of time. We've went 5 up to maybe 25 to 30 seconds of activity we've been able to get with these mechanisms. And again, it's just this substrate phosphorylation where you have the phosphate on creatine, put it onto the ADP, it gives us creatine and ATP, and we can use that for doing some of this stuff that the muscle may need. So if we're still contracting, we can use it to reset those myosin heads. If we're going into relaxation, we can use it to pump calcium back in there. We can use it to restore the membrane potential. And this is showing you what's happening with that myokinase. With that enzyme, if you have two ADPs, you can take one of them and get rid of a phosphate and turn it into adenosine monophosphate and gets us an ATP. So this is just showing us some of these ideas that we just talked about. Again, even at about this 30 seconds or so here, it really does take a little while for your breathing rate and your heart rate to ramp up to supply sufficient oxygen to these working muscles. So a lot of times we need to buy another minute to minute and a half of muscle contraction before your breathing rate and heart rate will come up and can start supplying your muscles with sufficient oxygen. What we do on this one is we do what's called lactic acid fermentation. And we'll talk about this. This is an anaerobic mechanism where you're now going to be using glucose to generate ATP, but doing it without oxygen. So when you do the first part of your cellular respiration pathways, that first part is glycolysis. In glycolysis, if you remember the process, and again, I don't need you to remember all the steps of it. I just need you to remember what happens at the beginning, what happens kind of in the middle, just a little part there, and then what you end up with. So you start with the glucose and glycolysis. You break this down into something called pyruvic acid. Along the way, this generates 2 more ATP than you spend. In the case of muscle contraction, this means you're generating ATP that can keep this muscle working. This is not particularly efficient. Normally with oxygen, you can get 36 ATP from that glucose. Here, we're only getting 2 to start with. The main problem is that some of those electron carriers that we use in glycolysis to provide stuff to the electron transport chain, the end part of your cellular respiration, those are limiting. And you need the NAD, these nicotinamides, to be able to take on those electrons and the hydrogen ions from this breakdown of glucose. One of the ways, and because those are limiting, we need to put them back into their non-reduced state. In order to do this, they put their hydrogen ions and electrons onto pyruvic acid and convert it into something called lactic acid. It then gets converted into lactate, and that is diffusing into the bloodstream. But this lactic acid fermentation is what allows us to get another minute or so of activity. So this pyruvate normally would go into, get converted to acetyl-CoA, go into the Krebs cycle. We would then take the byproducts of that and use it in the electron transport chain, using oxygen as the last acceptor, and convert that to ATP. If there's not enough oxygen, we have to convert it to lactate. Well, technically lactic acid, it then gets converted to lactate, goes into the bloodstream. Our heart, because it is getting always enough oxygen, it can get converted to fuel in the heart. So the heart can use this lactate as a fuel to power cellular respiration, going through the rest of the cellular respiration pathways. If there's enough oxygen left, or if you stop exercising, the liver can take this up and convert it back to glucose from that lactate. So that's what can happen to this pyruvic acid once it gets converted to lactate. Again, other muscle cells as well, these ones that we'll get into a little bit later on, called slow twitch muscles, they do usually have a little bit better blood supply. They can also be used as an energy source as well. The main problem with doing this lactic acid fermentation, and you can kind of see the idea right here, the main problem with this is it's not particularly efficient. You're generating 2 ATP per glucose instead of 36. Lactic acid also changes the pH of the muscle cells and is going to cause those muscles to not be able to contract as easily. Because of that, it will build up as a waste product and can lead to fatigue of the muscles. We do see this in certain sports. So things like hockey, things like basketball, where you're doing these quick bursts for periods of time at high intensity, it will have a tendency to go into this anaerobic metabolism. But then usually you're doing levels of a little bit lower activity where you can recover on these ones. So if you think about hockey and shifts, they go out there, they go hard for about 45 seconds, which is very anaerobic. They then go back to the bench, recover, go back out and do that again. What we generally have will happen if you're doing a sustained steady state activity, like going for a run, you're going to have this respiratory system, the cardiovascular system, get ramped up. So your heart rate is up, your breathing rate is up. You are now supplying more oxygen. And we can also sometimes have a little bit of stored oxygen with a molecule that's higher in slow twitch muscles called myoglobin. It is a muscle form of hemoglobin that can store a little bit of oxygen. But once you get up to a moderate level of activity in your breathing rate, you've had a couple minutes for your breathing rate and heart rate to come up, most of your energy at this point is going to be through this aerobic metabolism. And this is the stuff you learned in bio and biochem if you've had that. But where you're doing that electron transport chain, using those nicotinamides that are carrying the hydrogen ions, the NAD, the FAD, that is carrying those hydrogen ions through the electron transport chain, and then having oxygen as the final electron acceptor, that is anaerobic metabolism. Much more efficient at rest, at late even to moderate levels of exercise. 90+% of your ATP is going to come from these mechanisms. And again, this is happening in the mitochondria. That pyruvic acid goes through that Krebs cycle, then goes to the electron transport chain, is going to yield a much higher number of ATP per molecule of glucose versus 2 from anaerobic. Again, a much more efficient mechanism. This is ideally what we want to be doing. This is the type of activity you can sustain in the case of marathon running or ultra marathons for hours on end. The other thing we see is we do get, then this is one that I actually teach a class that I'm teaching right now, that we talk a little bit more about some of this stuff. It's a higher level physiology course that we talk about adaptations to exercise and the heat and altitude. One of the things that you realize with muscles is we really have, in all honesty, 2 different types of gas tanks if you want to think about what the body can use. When you're doing higher intensity activities, we tend to preferentially use carbohydrates. We only have enough of those for about 2 hours-ish of activity at that level. The body can also, if you're going a little bit slower, use fats, so we can use these triglycerides, and that is it's a preferential fuel molecule, like it says here, for skeletal muscle, as long as the intensity level isn't too high. As long as you have sufficient oxygen. The main thing is to break down triglycerides, it requires more oxygen per triglyceride than it does per carbohydrate. So if you're doing high intensity where oxygen is limiting, you burn carbs. If you have plenty of oxygen, you will preferentially try to use triglycerides, and even if you're very low weight, and that you are going to have a much higher level of triglycerides that are available to you. But again, we need sufficient oxygen to do this. So as you start going to higher levels of muscle activity, you will start having to go to carbs, which are a little bit more limiting. That glycogen, like I said, if you're preferentially using glycogen, you will run out in about 2 to 2.5 hours. So, and again, all these things, it's not one, then the next one, then the next one. There is this kind of spectrum, and it's going to be time as well as intensity. So you could be doing a steady state activity, let's say a race, and all of a sudden you start sprinting to try to pass somebody in, let's say, a longer 10K, or let's say you're doing a marathon and you're kicking to the line. You may go anaerobic at the end of that, even though you've been aerobic for most of the race. So it isn't just you only do anaerobic at the beginning and then it's only aerobic at the end. All these energy mechanisms I'm talking about can come on or off depending on what we're doing. I mean, if you're only doing a sprint, it's probably going to be entirely the phosphagen system. If you're doing like a 400 meter up to an 800 meter, that's going to be a lot of the anaerobic cellular respiration. 1500 meter or the mile, let's say, you're going to start out doing the phosphagen system, then go into anaerobic, and you'll be aerobic after a first minute or two. But like I said, even if you're doing a half marathon and you've been aerobic through the middle of that, if you start pushing hard to the line, you start picking up your intensity, you may go back to anaerobic respiration. You may start using lactic acid fermentation and that build up. So again, these things are all kind of on a spectrum, but it's not a spectrum of just time, it's also intensity. So if you also boost that intensity, you're going to go to these faster acting energy systems, back to anaerobic, back to the phosphagen system if you increase the intensity enough. And again, these aerobic energy systems, it really trains the respiratory system, the cardiovascular systems to deliver oxygen better. And a lot of times you can do longer activities higher intensity activities for a longer period of time if you do this sustained training each day or multiple days a week. But to me, understanding how the muscles and what energy systems are going to tap into where is one of the things I can ask, especially on an essay question on this stuff. So what you'd be doing in different parts. So if you were out running and you did this for this period of time, or you're doing it at a particular intensity, what's the energy source you're tapping into? That's important that you understand that type of stuff. The other thing you'll notice is anytime you've exercised, a lot of times before you exercise, you're breathing normally like I am now. Normal breaths in and out, that normal tidal volume. A lot of times after exercise, you get done and you don't get done and you're like, and then you're just back to normal. A lot of times if you're doing something, especially something intense, you're sitting there. This is referred to as oxygen debt. So one of the things your body tries to do is put as much as possible back to a pre-exercise state. And evolutionarily, this makes sense. You don't want to where you were chasing something, you caught it, and then you finally do that, and then all of a sudden a predator comes up. You wanted to be able to still try to be able to run away. So your body, evolutionarily, it makes sense that you put your body back to a rest state as quickly as possible so you could escape predators after you've done something particularly active. So this post-exercise breathing rate is really it actually you see a higher heart rate as well. But what you're doing on these ones is you're replenishing those oxygen sources. You're putting myoglobin back to that pre-exercise state. Any lactic acid that you've built up, you're delivering enough oxygen to the liver now to put it back to glucose. You're replenishing the phosphagen system. Ideally, you're replenishing glycogen stores, but that's not just oxygen. You actually need to bring in enough nutrients to do that, and that takes a few hours in all honesty. But you're also putting the muscle back to that pre-exercise state. So powering the sodium potassium pumps, powering the calcium pumps in the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Again, as much as possible, putting these muscles back to a pre-exercise state. That is what we refer to as that oxygen debt. And again, the longer you've been doing something or the higher intensity you did, generally the higher this breathing rate's going to be after exercise to try to put this stuff back. The other thing that's kind of interesting with muscles is we do have different types of muscle fibers. So each muscle cell is kind of its own fiber that we refer to. So muscle fibers, fast-twitch muscle fibers are also fast-twitch muscle cells. But what is interesting with these different fibers is we have fibers that kind of specialize in certain things a little bit. So you have what are called fast-twitch fibers. These are fibers that are very powerful fibers and fast-acting fibers. So they can contract very quickly once you get that stimulation to them. The reason they are able to do this is they have an enzyme that resets those myosin heads a lot faster. So they have a faster myosin ATPase. Because they can reset and do that faster, these muscles can contract fully quicker. So they can produce a contraction in a shorter period of time. And generally, because they're bigger fibers, can produce a stronger contraction. So like it says, they're greater power, greater speed than the slow twitch fibers. But if you have a faster ATPase, you're going to burn through ATP faster. So these fatigue easier. Slower twitch fibers, they have a slower ATPase, generally less fibers. It's going to take them longer to contract after stimulation. Their contraction isn't as strong, but they are able to do these contractions for longer periods of time. So that is what you're going to see with these slow twitch fibers. A lot of times we talk about these being oxidative fibers, so fibers that are using oxygen. So a lot of your slow twitch fibers are also oxidative, but you can see you can have some fast twitch fibers that are more oxidative. They're kind of this intermediate fiber. But more mitochondria, better supply of myoglobin, better capillaries, all these things that would deliver oxygen better. They tend to be fatigue resistant, where ones that are glycolytic tend to use glycolysis. That's where that name glycolytic is coming from. They're more anaerobic, less blood supply, less myoglobin, have large glycogen stores because they burn through ATP faster, but these ones can fatigue easier. So really, in reality, we have kind of three main types of fibers. You have the true slow twitch fibers, which are slow oxidative, called type 1 fibers. Slow ATPase, less powerful, but good ATP stores and supply, tend to look a little bit more red. We have what are called fast oxidative fibers. These are ones that are fast twitch fibers, but they're intermediate. They have good blood supply, so they kind of act like a middle fiber. Faster ATPase, but better blood supply, so they primarily do aerobic, but don't have as much myoglobin, and again, still burn through ATP a little bit faster than those slow oxidative fibers. Fast glycolytic fibers are the really large ones, super fast ATPase, very little blood supply, high power, high speed, but very fatigable. They burn through ATP super fast. These are like kind of like a funny car in drag racing, tons of fuel, super fast. Tend to be more white. So if you look at these ones, we can see we have these different fibers. Long distance runners are going to have a lot more slow oxidative, sprinters fast glycolytic, and you can kind of train those middle fibers to take on either characteristic a little bit. And you can see some differences in the diameter and the coloring of the slow twitch, the slow oxidative versus the fast glycolytic. And this is part of the reason if you've ever seen chickens, they have white breast meat and dark leg meat. That is because their legs are slow oxidative and their breast meat tends to be, their leg meat, like I said, slow oxidative, their breast meat, fast glycolytic. So they have muscles that are almost entirely one or the other. Humans, it's kind of more intermixed. But if you were to look at a duck, ducks actually have dark breast meat because they're a migratory bird, and they have those slow oxidative fibers in their flying muscles as well. So a lot of times muscle fatigue, this can be a decrease of glycogen stores or really a buildup of acidity in those muscles that causes the muscles not to work as well. And again, it's an inability to contract those muscles. Especially if it gets into changes in ion concentrations, we're not going to be able to contract those muscles. Again, lower calcium availability, can't keep this open. If you have calcium imbalances, increasing levels of free phosphate slow the rate of cycling down, which means you can't reset those heads as fast. So those are other things that can cause fatigue. And like I said, buildup of lactic acid in those muscle cells is going to make that interaction less efficient. So what we'll be talking about next here is this idea of muscle twitch. So I will see you next time.